Please. And the first item on the agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance, and please remain standing. That will be followed by a moment of reflection. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And we will have the reading of the notice, please.
An educational meeting of the Marathon County Board of Supervisors will be held at the Marathon County Courthouse Assembly Room, 500 Forest Street in the city of Wausau at 7 p.m. on Thursday, May 21st, 2020, and the agenda was duly signed and posted.
Thank you. I would like to request everyone, please, if you're on a call-in, please put your phones on silence or mute, and also anybody using WebEx, please put theirs on mute. And then I would request anybody here in the audience to put your cell phones or other electronic devices on mute or vibrate also, as to not interrupt the meeting. So then we will proceed to item number 5, roll call. I would ask the clerk to call roll, please.
Beestrom. Supervisor Beestrom. Boots. Supervisor Boots. Book.
Present.
Butke. Seiler.
Here.
Conway.
Here.
Dickinson.
Present.
Drebeck.
Here.
Pfeifferich.
Here.
Fisher.
Present.
Gaber. Gibbs.
Here.
Gonering. Guild.
Here.
Gums. Harris.
Present.
Jacobson.
Present.
Johnson. Krause. Lamont.
Present.
Longenhan.
Here.
Leahy.
Present.
Lowe.
Here.
Mask.
Here.
McEwen.
Here.
Oberbeck.
Here.
Opal.
Here.
Robinson.
Here.
Rosenberg.
Here.
Schley.
Here.
Soibert. Stark.
Here.
Van Cray.
Here.
Vol. Wagner.
Here.
Beestrom.
Here.
Boots. Gaber. Gonering. Gums. Soibert. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd like to acknowledge all of our visitors that we have joining us on public television. And we will proceed to educational presentations reports. Item number 7A, standing committee chairpersons or designees. Supervisor Robinson's recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Gibbs. I'd like to to give you an update on the Human Resources and Finance and Property Committee meeting from last week. We spent quite a bit of time talking about COVID-19 impacts to the budget, including the projected $5.2 million deficit for this year. And in the context of those discussions, we've directed Administrator Leonard to develop a plan that would address that deficit with using a 50% of our, to pay for it with 50% of coming out of reserves and a 50% of it coming out of budget adjustments that we will be presenting to the county board during our June meeting. We also spent some time looking at a proposal that was enacted in Act 185 relating to delaying the final property tax payment date from July 30th to October 1st. It would require county board action as well as the local governmental unit action to do that. The only community that we were aware of that was looking at was the city of Wausau. And in evaluating the proposal, it's well-intentioned, but there's a lot of concerns, and it would create some significant cash flow problems for the county because we need to pay the school districts, the technical colleges, the cities, villages, and towns their payments before we would receive the final payment, and the decision was not to proceed with that at this time. We also spent some time talking about how to address fees with various agencies. The state was looking at potentially expanding the fee period for retail food. We did not take any action at the committee level, preferring to rely on status quo because even under the state plan, they would have a 18-month license followed by a 6-month license, and we didn't see that as being beneficial to either the businesses affected by it or the county from a cash flow perspective. And finally, we had a request, and Extension Education Economic Development had a request from UW Stevens Point Wausau, also known as UWMC, to assist with installation and or maintenance of a security system. In both committees had endorsed it. Subsequent to the meeting, Ann Herter-Rapp, the dean for UWSP Wausau, UWMC, called and indicated that they were able to realize some savings in the installation of the system, and they are withdrawing their request from the county. So we will not be addressing that at the next week's meeting. So thank you.
Thank you. We've had one caller join us just within the last speaker. Could you please identify yourself? Again, there was one call-in user that just joined the webinar and call-in. If you could identify yourself, if you're a supervisor, I would appreciate it. Okay, we will move on. Other standing committee chairs or designees reports. Any other standing committee chairs or designee reports? All right, seeing none, we will move on to item 7B, County Clerk Report on absentee voting in the April election.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had received a request from a couple of supervisors for just a brief update on the absentee voting situation from the April election. And as you all know, we could call this adventures in having an election with all the back and forth that we did in the days leading up to that election. Some of you may be aware, some of you may not be aware, in the towns and many of the villages in Marathon County, the clerk is a one-man show. You have a municipal clerk who often works another full-time job on top of their clerk duties, and they are compensated and are used to working their clerk duties on a very part-time basis. So to say that this was a stretch for many of our clerks would be an understatement. However, they all, without exception, rose to the occasion. They did a phenomenal job in processing all of the absentee ballot requests that they got. One of the clerks mentioned to me that he just kind of did a rough estimate of his hours that he spent and figured he made about $2.30 an hour during the process of working the April election. So we have a very dedicated, very qualified, very good group of people out in our cities, villages, and towns working as municipal clerks. We did have an unprecedented number of absentee ballot requests for the April election. So we learned a lot. We learned that this is definitely probably the wave of the future. And the state, the Wisconsin Election Commission is going to have to make some changes to the online system where people request absentee ballots. And then the municipalities are going to have to step up a little bit as well and provide some help for these municipal clerks around election time to make sure that the ballots can all get processed in a timely fashion. The city of Wausau overall had a 39% absentee voting record for the April election. The towns, which we have about 40 towns in Marathon County, had a 49% absentee voting rate. The villages really outdid themselves with a 70% absentee voting rate. And the cities, not including Wausau, had a 61% absentee voting rate for the April election. Elections are an ongoing process in our office. You go to the polls, you vote, and you're done. We are still working on what is called reconciling the April election. We take all of the information from the clerks that we get in the days just immediately following the election. We have to make sure that everything was entered into the online system correctly. We have to make sure that everything balances and reconciles based on their numbers compared to what the election numbers were. So we are about finished reconciling the April election, and we are starting to work on reconciling the election from last week, the May 12th election. Thankfully, that was just a one-race election. So it's a little bit easier process for us to do. However, it's still time-consuming. We have to go through each municipality's information with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that all of the absentee requests were processed correctly, that all of the folks who voted on or who registered to vote on election day, that their information is entered into the system so that when they go to vote in August, they will be on the poll book. So it is an ongoing process, and shout out to my staff in the office. They are doing a phenomenal job with that, and the clerks just continue to do a very good job. Ballots for the August election will go out to the clerks June 24th. So we are going from election to election to election this year. So we're definitely keeping busy. So I don't know if anyone has any questions, if that's the prerogative of the chair to allow questions, but I'm happy to answer any of those if I can.
Is there any questions by the supervisors? Supervisor Robinson still has his hand raised. Do you have a question, Supervisor Robinson?
Do that, I'll take it down.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions? Any questions? Supervisor Krause?
Yes, I was wondering if there were any glitches in computer access to get some of the absentee voter applications and so on.
Can you tell me, what do you mean by glitches in computer access?
Well, I have heard that some of the places that had requested online and voted online, that those weren't, somehow they were flawed, or they didn't go through via the computer or whatever.
What happens
internet.
when a person logs on to the MyVote system to request an absentee ballot? Is that the system that you're referring to? You can enter your information. You also have to upload a picture of your photo ID. Sometimes if people didn't do that, the clerk received the request, the clerk would make an effort to contact the voter to ask them to submit a copy of their photo ID. If that didn't happen, by law, the clerk cannot mail out a ballot if they do not have a photo ID on file. So if there were glitches in the system, that would be where they were, was if the voter did not provide a photo ID.
Any other questions? Any other questions? Okay, seeing none, we will move on to item 7C, update on Marathon County government operation changes as a result of COVID-19 and state and federal guidance. And I would invite to the podium Administrator Leonard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The point of the presentation today is really to give an update to the information that was provided to the Executive Committee and referenced in the minutes in both the April and May meetings of the Executive Committee relative to the county's response in light of the COVID-19 epidemic. I will speak briefly about, well, relatively briefly about a couple domains of that response, and then I will turn it over to Corporation Counsel Corbett to talk more specifically about some of the implications of the Safer at Home decision that was issued by the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and I understand Chair Gibbs has some updates with respect to federal legislation that is pending. But very early on in March, we began what I'll call our COVID-19 response team, a group made up of leadership from across the county, Corporation Counsel, myself, Joan Toyer, our health officer, Sheriff Parks, Social Services Director Vicki Tilka, Emergency Management Director Phil Rentmeester, Finance Director Christy Palmer, Frank Mattel from Employee Resources, and Molly Adzik from Administration. We've been meeting multiple times per week to coordinate that countywide response. Again, I'll speak across a couple of domains. Our response has largely been around public health investigation and information, the external emergency preparedness, communication, and finally, internal operational changes. With respect to public health investigation and information, Joan Toyer and her team have done a great job. With respect to investigation, you've probably seen this talked about rather extensively in news reports. They are responsible, county health officials in the state of Wisconsin are responsible for contact tracing, that is identifying individuals who have tested positive, identifying close contacts, and taking necessary steps to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Recently, our health department expanded that effort. They have a contract in place in the event that increased levels of contact tracing are necessary, and we cannot do that internally. We also, as you likely saw in news reports, worked with Lincoln County to coordinate a response with the National Guard to have a community testing site where over 200 individuals were tested. As it relates to emergency, or excuse me, the sharing of information, I'll highlight you one specific action that I think is important. Given the particular nature of COVID-19 and it's the fact that it's relatively easily spread, we work to put in place a procedure, Corporation Counsel Corbett along with the sheriff and Joan Toyer, to put in place a mechanism where dispatch is advised of individuals that have been identified as infected with the virus during the period of that infection. That information is maintained by dispatch to ensure that emergency responders that have contact with that individual's residence or that individual are aware of that and utilize the necessary personal protective equipment. Joan and her team are responsible for, simply put, being the source of credible up-to-date information in Marathon County as it relates to COVID-19. So if you haven't seen press briefings, they have done press briefings. They have a web page on our website that is updated frequently. They've implemented a Facebook page relative to COVID-19, and I'm sure all of you have received the situational updates that are circulated by Board of Health Chair John Robinson, and those are authored by Joan Toyer. They also field numerous calls from the community and work with 211 to ensure that information is readily available. One interesting piece as it relates to external emergency preparedness that is different about our COVID-19 response from more traditional emergency efforts is that Phil Rentmeester, our emergency manager, has really been tasked by the State Emergency Operations Center and Wisconsin Emergency Management to be the point person locally for the distribution of personal protective equipment, which is unusual. Normally, Phil's job is in preparing people for emergencies, responding in the moment, but those emergencies are short in duration. This is fundamentally different. So as the state continues to oversee the procurement of personal protective equipment for law enforcement and emergency responders, as well as long-term care and medical organizations, Phil is a point person locally for those organizations to turn in the event they have an emergency need for personal protective equipment. Similarly, Joan Toyer has an emergency role with respect to our medical providers. She's worked closely with our various medical systems to ensure that they are prepared in the event of a surge in terms of infections. We've also undertaken similar work with respect to mortuary needs. Medical examiner Jessica Blahnik has put in place, along with Corporation Counsel, agreements that have been entered into with local medical providers for that need in the event we have that in our community, and we've secured various facilities in the event that need arises. And then finally, as it relates to emergency preparedness, Joan Toyer has entered into agreements with local hotels, motels, in the event we do need to have facilities for isolation and or quarantine. As it relates to communication, both internally and externally, that's been a real focus. Our staff, much like the general community, have a great many questions, and we've made an effort to ensure that we're providing accurate and up-to-date information. Joan is really the point person, Joan and her staff, as it relates to the communication of medical-related information to the external community, whereas if it's information relative to the county's response, Joan and I work collaboratively to take care of that. We've worked, I think, relatively well. We're fortunate in Marathon County to have an active group of municipalities, as referenced by the clerk. We hold, through McDevco, there are bi-weekly municipality meetings. Those meetings have been dominated by discussion of COVID-19, and we have been a source of information for those municipalities, not only relative to the county's response, but I think we've shared, to the extent we could, information on best practices for their individual response, including continuity of operations plans and employee policies. Now, as it relates to the heart of our response, the operational changes we've made, one of the big drivers of those operational changes are the seemingly unending orders, executive orders, Wisconsin decisions of the Supreme Court or orders from the Supreme Court, and then federal and state legislation. So as those pieces of information come down, we do our best to adapt and implement those locally. One of the first things we did in response to some of those orders was ask individual departments to update their continuity of operations plans. Just as a real quick background, a continuity of operations plan historically would be something, around after 9/11, there were a big push to update continuity of operations plans in the event your building was no longer suitable to deliver service. So you would be tasked with finding another alternate location to do the important work that you needed to do. Certainly COVID-19 is different. Those continuity of operations plans were not overly useful in responding to COVID-19. So we modified previously authored pandemic flu plans, put in place procedures for individual departments to update that information, and we've continually done so since that point.
Oh, God.
With respect to telework, we have really expanded the number of people that are able to take advantage of telework opportunities. Prior to March, we had about 30 people at any time during the day that would be utilizing what's called the Virtual Private Network, or VPN. Through the diligent efforts of Jerry Klein and his team, we now have a capacity of up to 500, and we're very frequently over 350 people working remotely. Social distancing and altering public access. For those of you that are in the courthouse today, you saw that, you're experiencing that right now in the way this room is set up and the processes that are in place in terms of hours at the courthouse. We restricted hours from the normal 8 to 4:30. Those have been restricted from 1 until 4 based on meetings we held with the circuit court judges to make sure that we were limiting access where is appropriate, and while still allowing the judges to do the important work that they need to do with our other court professionals. We've made numerous changes to our custodial practices in terms of disinfecting. Staffing changes have been implemented with altering start times and separating work groups. Our HVAC professionals through facilities and capital management have altered the way that we're bringing in fresh air. Simply put, we're increasing the amount of fresh air that's coming in, circulating that air to limit the potential risk for spread. And we're implementing rules through Parks, Recreation, and Forestry, posting information in our open spaces to ensure that users of those spaces are informed as to how to safely utilize those. Meeting technology, the technology that you're all utilizing today, or many of you are utilizing today, we've implemented throughout our organization as well. Not only for county board meetings and committee meetings, but for staff meetings, court hearings. Court hearings right now are held exclusively through Zoom to be in compliance with the Supreme Court's order that it issued relative to court appearances, and also limit the number of people coming in and out of the courthouse. Credit to the district attorney's office, our court system, the sheriff's office, state public defender, corporation counsel. They've all done a really good job of making that transition. And we continue to do that. Jerry Klein and his team likewise have done a great job getting that IT support into our courts. One big area, and this is what Scott's going to talk about when he talks about the future in light of the Supreme Court's decision on Safer at Home. We've spent a lot of time really on internal policy assessment and development. It feels like quite a long time ago, but the federal law that was passed, the Families First Coronavirus Relief Act, made significant changes with respect to employment rights and employment benefits for staff. We actually implemented internally here in Marathon County, we put many changes in place prior to that act that were then reinforced through the FFCRA. So as those changes were handed down, both as the situation changed locally, but then as legislation was passed, we've continued to adapt. We implemented policy language following the order, the Safer at Home order, and we certainly made policy changes following the decision of the Supreme Court invalidating that order. And then last, with respect to our response, is really a financial response, and this was referenced by HR Finance Property Chair Robinson. We've recognized very early on that the pandemic was going to have significant impact on Marathon County from a financial perspective. So we've really begun to attempt to forecast what that looks like. Initial forecasts were ranging from a $3 million to $4 million shortfall for the remainder of 2020. But as the Chair Robinson referenced, as we continue to get up-to-date information, that projected shortfall has grown to $5.2 million. If you want to have additional information, I encourage you to look at the packet from the recent HR Finance and Property meeting, and that was put together by Finance Director Christy Palmer, and it projects out on a 4-year rolling basis, that financial projection through 2020 through 2024. So we've continued to keep an eye on that. We've implemented several things. We're certainly monitoring available grants through FEMA and CDC and other sources to make sure we're capturing as much of that grant revenue as possible. We've been tracking and coding our expenditures. And we also have implemented a couple of cost control strategies. There are certainly some departments, you probably are aware that the library has been closed for some time to the public. Recently implemented public pickup and is making plans for reopening. But we attempted to take those individuals from positions that were perhaps not being utilized to their full capacity and redeploy some of those individuals in ways that would allow us to make some progress on longstanding projects or simply help out in those departments where there was increased need. And as we move forward, we're going to develop that plan as referenced by Chair Robinson to accomplish that $2.6 million of budget correction yet in 2020 before developing a balanced budget in 2021. So in short, it's been a very busy last two plus months. I give a lot of credit to the team that's been meeting, the COVID response team, as well as all of our staff. They've responded very admirably in light of these challenges. So I feel confident that we will be able to develop that plan and present that to the board in June and move forward with any necessary policy changes we need to do. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Scott to talk about Safer at Home and how the Supreme Court's recent decision changes operations in Marathon County and what the next steps are.
Well, Safer at Home doesn't exist anymore, so. Is that all? Am I good with that? I just wanted to just say a brief word that I think that it's been great working with Lance on the COVID team, and I think everybody there has really taken this matter seriously, and we meet 3-4 times a week occasionally to try to get things done so that we can keep running the policies and responding to the issues that we have to respond to. The case of Wisconsin Legislature versus Palm was particularly exciting because it dropped right in the middle of an executive committee meeting, and so we had the fun of reading the case right off the computer screen to the committee members at that time, and trying to do our best in terms of interpreting that. I guess I would say a couple words in introduction. I think we're all very cognizant of the fact that there is a tremendous spectrum out there of reactions to COVID and reactions to the orders and to the decisions. We certainly have, and I'm sure that many of you have experienced that spectrum as well, from constituents contacting you, we all tend to kind of view these things through the lens of whether we agree with them or not. But be that as it may, I guess what my advice is with respect to our view of this particular case. It is what it is. I hate saying that line, but it is. It exists. We're going to move on, adapt to that as we have to all the other issues that have come before us. I would say that there are several things that the case did not change, as you are aware. It struck down the Safer at Home order number 28, that was supposed to continue through May 26th, and it did so immediately. There was no stay of the effectiveness of that judgment. That judgment did not affect the nature of COVID in the state of Wisconsin. There are still many cases. There are still people that are being hospitalized every day. There are still people that are dying almost every day of COVID in Wisconsin. The legal landscape changed, but the nature of the illness and virus did not. The decision did not affect the power of the governor. The Supreme Court took particular care to state that directly in the opinion, and so we'll see what the governor and his office does. But it did not affect the power of the governor. It did not address that. It also did not affect the power of local health officers. It interpreted a statute that authorized acts by the Department of Health Services. It did not affect the statutes that enable local health officers to issue orders. So looking ahead, that's part of what we're going to be working on going forward here, how to address situations as they occur in Marathon County going forward. Just briefly, the legal part of this evening is just a brief review of what the case said. The case invalidated order number 28 for two reasons. It said first that the secretary designee did not engage in rulemaking procedures. In fact, the secretary admitted that they did not go through the rulemaking. They issued an order ordering persons to stay home, to not engage in travel, unless they were engaged in a list of essential functions, and it also limited public and private gatherings. But they did not go through the rulemaking process. The Wisconsin Supreme Court ruled that, in fact, the order, even though it said it was an order, it actually was a rule. And therefore, since the secretary had not gone through the rulemaking process, the order was invalid for that reason. But they said, let's move on from that. Let's assume that it is an order. Let's look at whether or not the secretary exceeded her authority under the statute, and they also invalidated the order on the basis of exceeding authority. And the principal idea in the exceeding authority argument is that the Safer at Home order essentially quarantined everyone in the state of Wisconsin, not just individuals who were infected or suspected of being infected with a communicable disease. And it also limited travel, and it limited both public and private meetings on the basis of an effect on everyone within the state of Wisconsin, except for a laundry list of exceptions. And the Supreme Court found that the secretary had exceeded her authority in issuing an order of that kind. Now, the part that does affect Marathon County going forward is that the Supreme Court went on to say, well, even though we've invalidated this order, we're going to go a step further and say that this order would not have been enforceable through any kind of criminal penalties, because the secretary had said that anyone who violated the order could be subject to criminal prosecution pursuant to statute. And the Supreme Court found that the order itself did not provide adequate notice of the kinds of conduct that would result in criminal penalties, and that that's a necessary element in all criminal penalty statutes. And because this order was so overbroad, that it would not have been enforceable criminally. And in fact, they kind of circled back to the argument of saying, well, had they gone through the rulemaking process, that would have provided some due process check and balance so that perhaps the secretary would not have exceeded that authority, and their order would have been, or their rule, if they had proceeded correctly, would have been enforceable. So that, in very broad terms, is the rationale that the Supreme Court used. Now, that decision came down on Wednesday evening, and the next day there were a lot of reactions to that ruling. On that particular day, several counties, as you're aware, and municipalities issued their own versions of Safer at Home, indicating that their county or their municipality was going to, essentially they adopted the same language from Order Number 28. But I think as the whole enforceability issue started to percolate among those counties and those municipalities, you actually saw them withdrawing their orders and saying that they were not going to, that they were going to withdraw the order and to reevaluate. And so many counties and municipalities are still in the process of doing that. As far as I know, Dane and Milwaukee County have not withdrawn their versions of Safer at Home, and so they're going to go their own way. But certainly most of the counties surrounding Marathon County did not issue that kind of order. And Marathon County did not either. Marathon County issued what's called Order Number 1. Order Number 1 took the tack that Marathon County was adopting a series of recommendations from the CDC, from the Wisconsin Department of Health Services, and the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation regarding how to socially distance, regarding how to engage in proper personal hygiene, regarding how to be safe in reopening businesses. Marathon County adopted a series of recommendations. The recommendations did not come with any civil or criminal penalties at this time. So this was not a situation where Marathon County had to withdraw anything. Marathon County, we did put it in the form of an order, though, and there were a couple of reasons for that. Number one, we wanted to affirmatively state some of the really important issues that we see to be evaluated going forward, and I'll list those off for you briefly. That order is also available on the website for the health department, which you can access through the Marathon County website. But these are the principles that we said are going to continue to inform responsibility or inform decisions as we go forward in Marathon County. First, protecting public health and safety are our primary responsibility. Second, continuation and resumption of business and personal activity is essential to the well-being of our community. Third, scientific data and local information must guide our public health decision-making. 4, any orders issued, it will be consistent with established legal authority. That was the part that I put in. Any orders will strive to avoid inequity amongst the individuals, businesses, and communities impacted. Gathering perspectives from local stakeholders is valuable. And finally, and very importantly, we trust that the residences and businesses will follow recommendations and guidance from the public health authorities to protect each other. And among the various reactions we've certainly all seen, I think we're all heartened by the fact that the vast majority of those reactions have been people reacting with continued caution, continued care about themselves, about their relatives and friends, about their employees, and about their customers. So I think our consideration of that issue was very well founded, and I think we can all feel good about that kind of guidepost or the guideposts that we have set out for ourselves going forward. So that was Marathon County's reaction. But based on the enforceability and the language that's in the Supreme Court case, we're looking at going forward with trying to propose an ordinance in order to be followed by the health department with respect to going forward to issuing future orders in Marathon County. We don't have a draft, obviously, that we're presenting tonight. We anticipate that we'll be coming to you next month with that language, and we're going to work our way through every committee that we can possibly work it. Now, I believe we're going to work through the Board of Health. We're going to work through Health and Human Services Committee, and we're also going to work through the Executive Committee and come to the board, as well as I know Lance has been busy trying to reach out to get other perspectives with respect to how we want to craft an ordinance going forward in Marathon County. Couple of things with respect to that, and I'm going to get a little technical here, but there are many sources for seeing what gating criteria are in order to look at different levels of restriction. Those gating criteria are the number of cases that you have in your particular municipality, the capacity of the healthcare providers to provide care in that community, the amount of PPE available in that community, and the contact tracing things that are resources that are also available. Those are familiar with it, and they're called gating criteria. But there's another really important factor that we're going to bring to Marathon County's continuing response to this, and that is that individual orders should be tailored individually to specific data that exists in Marathon County. The law that allows local health officers to make orders essentially was created so that if there's a cholera outbreak somewhere in Marathon County, there's going to be someone on the ground who's going to be able to go to that location, investigate the situation, and make appropriate orders to limit that outbreak. And one of the really inequitable features of Safer at Home was that everyone was quarantined. We're looking at a more specifically grounded restriction situation where we would limit that to just because you have a particular outbreak of COVID in one particular place doesn't mean that you shut down the entire county. So with that, looking at that, we're looking at 4 particular levels of restriction that we'll bring to you in an ordinance format, but we're looking at individual isolation or quarantine orders that would be effective to individuals that have tested positive for COVID or are deemed to be close contacts of individuals who've been tested positive. There are other possible organizations or businesses. What the Department of Health does at the present time is they do restaurant inspections. If there's a restaurant that has a health issue, they close that restaurant and require cleaning of that restaurant. They don't close every restaurant in Marathon County because they have one that has an issue. So we'd be looking at possibly individual closures. The third level would be a larger locality within the county. Let's say there's a village or other municipality where there happens to be a serious outbreak. We would look at that kind of limited kind of order for that particular locality, and then the broadest possible under the existing statute would be something that would be effective county-wide. But again, you'd be looking at those much broader criteria. If there's a huge outbreak and our local hospitals are unable to handle the surge in the number of people that are being hospitalized, that obviously is going to be cause for a more widespread situation. We all hope and pray that that's not going to come to pass, and that everybody's continued individual efforts are going to continue to yield a lower, much slower spread of the COVID going forward. But we want to be ready with an ordinance that has been passed by the county board. So unlike in situations in perhaps the state capitol, we're going to do this together. We're not going to have one arm saying, dictating this, and another arm saying, well, we don't agree. we're going to all do this together, and if we do pass an ordinance, it'll be something that'll be passed by the entire board. So that's the view from here. Am I taking questions?
Yeah, as soon as we're all done, I think we'll open it up to the board for questions. I will give a little brief information about a meeting that I attended today through NACO, and give you an update on some of the latest legislation that's being worked on. The the U.S. House of Representatives last week passed what they're calling now the HEROES Act. It's an 1,800-page piece of legislation with a price tag of roughly $3 trillion. There's several things that are in that piece of legislation that NACO supports. Probably the main thing in that legislation is there's some direct support back to counties directly, rather than as in the CARES Act, there was some direct support to municipalities, but it was only municipalities with populations in excess of 500,000. The CARES Act did allocate most of the resources directly to the states, and of that so far, 18 states have chosen in varying degrees to share some of those funds with counties and cities and other municipalities. Some are direct, and some of them are more, I would say, more liberal in the amount that they're sharing with the municipalities. The extreme would be the state of Alaska is sharing 45% of the CARES Act money that they receive directly with municipalities themselves. But with that said, the state was thankful for the CARES Act money that we did receive. However, one of the critical things in the piece of legislation in the CARES Act was that those funds are not allowable to be utilized to backfill budget shortfalls on loss of revenue. One of the things in the HEROES Act it does do is it does authorize that there would be utilization of not only the CARES Act money to be used for budget shortfall, but the money that they're directing in the CARES Act itself, or in the HEROES Act itself, would be usable. And again, it would be funding money directly to counties and not through the state. As you probably have heard, the Senate now has that bill, but the leadership in the House or in the Senate and multiple individuals have said that that piece of legislation is dead on arrival. There is more and more movement, however, on additional legislation. NACO knows at this point that that's a starting point. The HEROES Act may be the starting point to actually having discussions about what is needed. Just what was reported today, that 36.8 million Americans are unemployed as of today. Again, the HEROES Act would direct $375 billion to cities and counties. The 187.5 of that would go directly to counties of all size, and that would be distributed over a 2-year period. 2/3 of that would be distributed immediately, and 1/3 of that would be distributed in 2020. But again, I think at least the Senate is working on its own pieces of legislation. There is a bill that has shown, it has bipartisan support. It's offered by Senator Casey and Senator Menendez. That would add about $500 billion to state and counties, and also $15 billion for transportation and infrastructure. Of that, about 80 billion would be directed to the counties through the state. It's kind of they have a rather different formula in the Casey Mendez legislation. That would, the formula for distribution, 1/3 of that money that would go to counties would be based on population. 1/3 of that distribution would be based on infection rate, and then 1/3 of that would be based on lost revenue. There also is a companion bill in the House that was bipartisan again, and so the hopes are on NACO, and we're talking with senators and legislators, understanding that you know, the CARES Act money, although went to the state, is, and there's some talk about, you know, going back and reauthorizing some of that to be used for lost revenue. The concern is because those funds are held by the state, and the state clearly has its own budget issues that may be very, very problematic for counties. And so we want to impress upon our legislature that there's additional shortfalls, as the administrator alluded to. Just this year alone, the projection is $5.2 million for Marathon County. NACO's working on providing as much information. The current data that NACO has estimates the lost revenue for all 3,069 counties in the United States at $144 billion over the next 12 months. We work on one of the, there's some upcoming NACO calls that will be dealing with the natural disasters on May 28th, and also administrating safe elections on June 3rd. Again, only 18 states right now have shared any of the CARES Act money that went directly to the states. Again, there was some, roughly 5% of the counties that were in excess of 500,000 received funding direct, but the remainder of the counties had to receive any of that CARES money had to come through the state. So that's about all I have on NACO is working diligently to inform the legislature the needs that are out there, and if they were to just reauthorize using the CARES Act money to backfill budget deficits, that that need would be very underfunded. So with that, I would open it up for questions from the board for any of the presenters, whether it be the administrator, Corp Counsel, or myself. Any questions from the board? Supervisor Krause.
I have some questions, and I'm not sure if it's relevant to what we're discussing now, but I was just wondering, I know that a lot of medical facilities have been shut down because of COVID-19, and that many of the medical staff have been furloughed or laid off. And one question is the money going to that? And also, do we know how many serious illnesses have developed or deaths because many people could not access medical care during the time that the medical system was not seeing other people? Thank you.
Supervisor, or excuse me, Administrator Leonard.
With respect to the first part of your question, allocation of funding for medical facilities, including long-term care. Just today, I believe Governor Evers indicated that he was allocating $100 million in the state of Wisconsin for medical providers of the CARES Act funding that the state received for long-term care facilities and medical providers. With respect to the second question you had, I don't have that information.
And as far as the proposed legislation, the HEROES Act does provide some direct funding to hospitals and medical facilities, because in some states, counties actually operate hospitals. So that's why I would, that was information that was provided during the NACO call. Okay, we have Supervisor Leahy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to state that I did have a constituent reach out to me this week regarding county employees specifically at the courthouse not wearing masks on their shifts. So I was just kind of wondering, as we go along and update our guidelines, update our own employee recommendations for safe working and being safe with the public, do you foresee us going from merely recommending that employees wear masks and make that more of a mandatory feature going forward?
I'll allow the administrator to answer that. That's an operational question.
Thank you for the question. Within the courthouse, certainly we've implemented a number of things to prevent the spread of the virus, including a lot of physical barriers. If you've been to the county clerk's office, treasurer's office, corporation counsel, register of deeds, and clerk of courts, those barriers are in place. Our current policy is we do recommend masks for individuals in the event they're going to be unable to fiscally distance with staff. In fact, that's we are moving toward revising that policy and providing masks. We do have masks available for staff, but to your point about input from the public, I likewise probably received the same contact you did, and I think certainly it points to the fact that the idea that Corporation Counsel said, there are certain individuals that we need to do, make sure we're doing everything we can to ensure that they feel safe and comfortable coming to our buildings, whether it's the courthouse or any other facility. So as we get that feedback, we're going to continue to do better and make those masks available. I'll say one other thing. As we open up the courthouse, I had a couple meetings with judges today. We firmly anticipate to receive an order from the Supreme Court, at least based on the information that was provided by our chief judge. We anticipate receiving an order in the very near future relative to court operations, and that order may require the exact thing that you're talking about and provide guidance for wearing masks in court, as well as other aspects of the court process leading to reopening the courts and allowing for jury trials, which are currently suspended.
Supervisor Lamont.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I received a call regarding, I guess this would be for Lance, Administrator, that this person thought the county parks were closed till August 1st, so that would affect the Little League and youth programs, killing them. But then I heard Lance sort of say that the county parks aren't closed. There's clarification on that.
Sure, thank you. County parks themselves are open. We have posted, and we are going to continue to post with respect to playgrounds, that they are temporarily closed based on guidance from the CDC. But they will not be, at this point, roped off or surrounded by snow fencing. With respect to specific uses of facilities, you referenced baseball. In light of guidance from state DHS and CDC, we are not leasing ball diamonds or athletic fields to organize sporting events based on that guidance. However, many of those ball fields that are not operated as enterprise funds will remain open to the public. So I live across from Memorial Park. There is nothing stopping me from going to Memorial Park. Memorial Park is open. We encourage residents and visitors to utilize our parks in a way that is appropriate and practice fiscal distancing. Likewise, if I wanted to go down to the Ball Diamond and play catch with my son, I can do that. Those are not, Memorial Park Ball Diamond is not going to be closed off. Some of our facilities, however, that are utilized for organized sports, the East Bay Sports Complex and Sunnyvale Softball Complex, are not open. I don't know if that answers your question, Supervisor.
Yep, thank you.
Okay, Supervisor Gums. Supervisor Gums is recognized.
You hear me now?
Now we can hear you.
For the new members, you might explain NACO a little bit more and what your involvement there. You use the term a lot, and I don't know if the new people know what it is.
Sure. Thank you for that question. Sometimes we in government, and if you've been in government long time, as some of us have, 14 years plus, we use acronyms all too often. NACO stands for the National Counties Association. The National Counties Association is the organization that represents all 3,069 counties in the United States. As WCA, Wisconsin Counties Association, represents the Wisconsin counties, the 72 counties, and provides a conduit for information, provides information, not only provides lobbying efforts on its platform for all county members, as so does NACO. NACO, our National Counties Association, represents all 3,069 counties and lobbies at the federal on behalf of the all counties and the collective platform that the National Counties Association represents. I have been fortunate enough to serve on multiple committees at the National Counties Association. I've served on the Ag Committee. I was a vice chair on the Ag Committee. I serve on the National Counties Association now, the Finance and Intergovernmental Affairs Committee. And now I have been, this last term, I was elected to the National Counties Association Board of Directors that the state of Wisconsin has one member on its representing the board at the NACO board. So that's a quick overview of what NACO is. NACO, again, lobbies on behalf of all 3,069 counties. It's nonpartisan. It tries to do what it can as far as information, providing information and leadership education and opportunities for its members. Next, we have Supervisor Lowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a question for Administrator Leonard. Can you tell us what they're doing differently in the jail? Because I know that the inmates, they can be very close together sometimes. And so what are the preventative measures that they're doing in the jail?
Sure, I can give you some information, but probably not to the level of detail that you'd want. One important thing that the jail is doing is screening. So I know they are asking, they're being very careful with who they let into the facility, much like the prison system to prevent the state prison system and others that you probably have seen in news media. They're really restricting who comes in to the facility as the first line of defense in preventing the spread. Likewise, that puts the jail in an interesting position because they're unable to get some of the inmates that would otherwise be going to the prison system out because the prison system's not willing to take them. But in addition to that, they've worked closely with local law enforcement to even prevent or limit the number of people that are being booked and then released. So they've implemented some process improvements in that regard. They have limited public visitation to, again, prevent the risk of that spread. They have worked with the court system to implement the use of Zoom and other electronic technologies to, again, as I indicated, really keep people from moving in and out of the facility. They are working to take those individuals, they had done this already, looked at the jail population and implement as many safeguards that they can put in place to have individuals that can be in the community, as opposed to being in the facility. So those are a lot of things that they've done in the short term. I can tell you, I met with the jail administrator this morning, as well as other court leadership, judges, district attorney, public defender's office, and others. They are working to allow for public visitation, reinstitute public visitation beginning June 1st. I credit the jail administrator and her staff for doing that. I think we all recognize the ability to have meaningful contact with family and friends is vitally important to all of our well-being. That is absolutely true for each of us in this room, those appearing virtually, and for all the residents we have in the jail. So those are some of the things that we're working on doing. We're also working to reinstitute court proceedings so that we don't have as many individuals within the jail and their cases not moving quickly as possible through the criminal justice system. Right now, we have between 80 and 85% of our jail inmates are there pre-trial. That is, they have not been convicted and are not serving a sentence. So that gives you some idea of the process changes that the sheriff's office and the jail administrator have put in place.
Okay, any other questions? One last question. Any other questions from the supervisors? Supervisor Gomes, you still have your hand raised. Did you have another question?
Sorry.
Thank you. Moving on, then, we will have the presentation on the trauma-informed care, and I would invite the administrator to introduce the speakers on the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just as a brief means of background, the 2018-2022 strategic plan, objective 3.3, strategy E, calls for the county board to approve a plan that creates a trauma-informed response system for services we provide. So what you're going to hear today, you're going to hear about our work to complete a trauma-informed care assessment. And it's my pleasure to introduce Aiden Lorenz from Social Services, as well as Amanda Lee from Corporation Counsel's Office. They work together with Samantha Pinzel to conduct that assessment of the services that we provide and identify some strategies for Marathon County to be more trauma-informed in the work that we do. And so they're going to provide you an overview of what trauma-informed care is, what things we're currently doing, and based on their review of best practices, what are the things that we could do both in the short term and as well as the long term to improve the experience that we the services that we provide and the experiences that our customers and clients have. So with that, I'll turn it over to Aiden and Amanda. They should be available electronically. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, here we are.
Okay,
Hi, everyone.
I will work the slideshow. So when you want me to advance the slide, please let me know. And just for supervisors, within your packet, you have a series of slides that Amanda and Aiden will go through. You also have the full plan, the trauma-informed care assessment plan. That is in your packet as well. That was approved by Health and Human Services a couple meetings ago.
Thank you, Lance. Hi, everyone, and thank you for allowing us to share some of your time tonight. It's definitely an unusual time, and trauma-informed care is more relevant than ever, I think. At the same time, we really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you while we know you have so many other things to be thinking about and discussing. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Aiden Lawrence. I've been with the Department of Social Services for about 4 years now. I serve as the Independent Living and Kinship Care Coordinator. So in those roles, I work with our teens in foster care, helping them develop the life skills they need as they transition through their teen years into adulthood. And I also work with our relative caregivers who take in children when the birth parents are unable to care for them. In addition to that, I lead our secondary traumatic stress committee at Social Services. So positioned well for a project like this. Lance already mentioned, Amanda Lee and I have been working on this project. They approached us last summer to complete an assessment. And we'll tell you a little bit more about that tonight. We'll give you an overview of trauma-informed care, talk a little bit about our assessment process, our key findings, and then some recommendations for the county moving forward. So if there's time permitting, we'd be happy to answer any questions at the end. But before we dive in, Amanda's going to share a little about herself and give you an overview of trauma-informed care.
Hi, my name is Amanda Lee. I am an assistant corporation counsel handling primarily child protection cases. I joined Marathon County's team a little over a year ago, and before that, I was at the Public Defender's Office, where I also had an interest in trauma-informed care. We started this project by researching trauma-informed care at an academic level, looking at best practices as well as how other organizations implement the principles into practice. If you're interested in trauma-informed care, our report does contain an appendix with an assorted list of resources that we used and more information. I'd encourage you to look into that yourselves. Our goal with this was to provide readers a shared definition of trauma, describe some of the harmful effects of experiencing trauma, and then share an overview of what trauma-informed care as a concept is that we can put into practice in our everyday work. So trauma is defined as a deeply distressing or disturbing experience or series of experiences. And it's often described as the 3 E's of trauma: the event, the experience, and the effect. In other words, people can experience the same event, abuse, divorce, discrimination, the current pandemic, but they each experience it in their own way and feel the effects differently. A trauma-informed approach encourages us to shift our perspective so that we are acknowledging the harmful effects of trauma, we're preventing further re-traumatization, and we're promoting healing. Being trauma-informed is important at a number of levels. We looked at it through customers, the customers that we serve, whether that's the general public, people we serve either voluntarily or involuntarily. A lot of the sheriff's department's customers are not necessarily being served on a voluntary basis, but we do need to be aware of the traumatic experiences that people are going through. We look at being trauma-informed with each other, staff at all levels, and ourselves in how we care for and manage our secondary traumatic stress. Many of you are probably familiar with the concept of secondary traumatic stress. And it is important to note that that is one aspect of being trauma-informed, but they are not synonymous. It is just one part of a greater system. When creating a trauma-informed system of care, we looked at a number of considerations which Aiden will now address.
Thanks, Amanda. And Lance, I can't see what slide you're on, but we should be on slide 3 with SAMHSA's 6 principles. So picking up where Amanda left off and taking a trauma-informed approach, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, acronyms, identifies 6 key principles. And those are, if you're looking at the slide or in the assembly room and can see the slide, those are safety, trustworthiness, empowerment, collaboration, peer support, and history, gender, or cultural effects. So if we think about trauma, if you yourself have experienced trauma, if you know someone who has, people who have experienced trauma have typically felt unsafe or voiceless or isolated. They maybe have had their trust in someone or something lost, or their sense of identity violated in some way. So the trauma-informed approach, looking at these principles, recognizes those effects and helps to restore and heal those losses. I think it's really important to point out that trauma-informed care isn't just a list of things that we check off and then move on from. It's an approach to our service. It's an approach we take, like Amanda said, with those we serve and with each other at all levels. And I think it's an approach that, when done well and consistently, can really improve our outcomes. So as you will see throughout this presentation, and looking at our report, the principles really guided our assessment and recommendations. So before we get into our findings, Amanda's going to describe our process a little bit more.
After we started with researching what it means to be trauma-informed, we then turned to our own organization. We started by selecting these 9 departments and across Marathon County that we identified as being trauma-facing, meaning that these departments work with trauma-impacted individuals or have staff who are regularly exposed to trauma. We should note that we looked really just at Marathon County government and departments as opposed to other organizations in the community where being trauma-informed is also important, but we narrowed the scope to what our organization is doing. We started with those 9 departments and then continued by interviewing members of leadership teams. So there were 32 individuals of those departments that were personally interviewed. We created a survey where we sought input from all staff in those 9 departments. So for that, we received almost 150 responses. And I would note that that survey was sent to department heads with the request that they provide it to their staff. Some department heads really encouraged 100% participation from their staff members. Others forwarded it without expectations or did not forward it to staff at all. And again, if you're interested, the interview questions and staff survey questions are contained in the appendix to the report. On the next slide, we look at kind of how we broke it down. When surveying these departments, we focused our attention on 3 categories: people, physical spaces, and policies and procedures. People focuses on staff training and support surrounding trauma and trauma-informed care, as well as secondary traumatic stress mitigation. Physical spaces really looks at our physical environments with regard to their physical and emotional safety, as well as their ability to protect confidentiality and provide adequate break spaces and meeting rooms. And finally, looking at policies and procedures, we looked at the formal policies and the informal practices we have and how those incorporate principles of trauma-informed care. For the next part of the presentation, we're going to break down each of these categories more specifically, looking at the benchmarks of a trauma-informed organization, the strengths and gaps we identified, and then our recommendations for next steps. Aiden's going to start with people.
Aiden, I think you're muted.
Thank you for that. Still getting used to this tech world that we're living in.
We can hear you now, thank you.
Okay, great. So we'll be on slide 7, beginning with people, our most valuable resource. We looked at these benchmarks, and then in order to identify how we measured up to these benchmarks, we asked staff a few things: whether they feel they have adequate training to help a client who's experienced trauma, if they believe staff in their department have the training to adequately respond to trauma-impacted persons, the extent to which they're aware of resources if they themselves are experiencing secondary traumatic stress, and the extent to which we seek and incorporate customer input throughout our work. So again, there's a full list of these survey and interview questions in the appendix if you want to take a look. On the next slide, you'll see some bulleted strengths and gaps. Some of the strengths that we found, really overall, we saw a strong sense of teamwork come through. Again and again, we heard from staff, their responses indicated they felt like their team, the people they worked with, were their work family. So a really good sense of cohesiveness and really strong communication. We also heard staff acknowledge genuine efforts to see and understand the trauma and its impacts on the people they serve. And then we also noticed that there was a strong desire for more training, more understanding, more opportunities to practice trauma-informed care. When it comes to the gaps or the challenges with our trauma-informed care practice, trauma-informed care practice takes time. If you think back to those 6 principles, developing trust, collaborating with others, giving people a voice, all of those things require extra time, extra skill, and conscious choice to incorporate them. So we found that some people are more naturally inclined to exhibit and practice those principles. This might be based on their, personal history, characteristics, training, comfort level, and other factors. We also recognize that some staff work in roles that are perceived to be in conflict with trauma-informed care. For example, if we've got, social workers removing children or officers making arrests, those are examples of activities that can create trauma. And it's not that we want to, have people stop making arrests or stop removing children from unsafe situations, but more that we overcome the idea that accountability and trauma-informed care are mutually exclusive. Another gap that we identified is that we're not fully aware of how trauma-informed our community partners are. So whether it's medical professionals, placement providers, mental health practitioners, schools, or anyone else we might team with, when we make a referral, as trauma-informed as we are, we can't guarantee that further traumatization or re-traumatization won't occur. So looking at our recommendations then, slide 9 now, there are a number of things we can do to increase the quality of service we provide through a trauma-informed approach. We wanted to identify some quick wins, so some things that we can incorporate into existing mechanisms, like offering sessions on trauma-informed care during MLK Junior Day On, or incorporating questions about trauma-informed care and secondary traumatic stress in staff meetings or during supervision, and then providing resources to staff. We can put lists of books, webinars, podcasts, newsletters, action posters, visual checklists. We found a whole assortment that are already existing, and staff can use those to educate themselves and also to empower those they're working with to understand their trauma, their triggers, and manage it better. Thinking longer term, we could also be intentional and strategic in our efforts by designating a lead staff person to coordinate and maintain a trauma-informed system of care with the support of a team. And we can ensure adequate staffing levels to support workload and customer needs. So there's a full list of recommendations in the report on page 11, but next Amanda will talk a little bit about our physical spaces assessment.
When applying trauma-informed care principles to our physical spaces, we look at how our public and private work areas support a feeling of physical and emotional safety. So to identify how we measured up to those benchmarks, we asked staff questions like whether spaces included calming elements, whether spaces felt safe and welcoming or inclusive to people of all sexual orientations, genders, ethnicities, abilities, backgrounds, etc. If they had adequate break space, and if work and meeting spaces allowed for confidentiality. We did identify some real strengths, which are listed on page 13 of the report. Departments recognize the need for trauma-informed spaces, and some of them have sought customer and employee input when planning for changes. And there have been some real key renovations to break spaces, waiting rooms, meeting rooms that have specifically taken into account the impact on customers and staff alike. Some of those examples are the district attorney's office victim witness room, there's the Acorn room at the health department, the interview room at the sheriff's department, and the Department of Social Services break room and waiting room renovations. The renovations are more important than just looking nice. For example, at the Department of Social Services, the renovations included restroom access from the waiting room. This means that customers have more autonomy. They don't have to ask permission to be allowed to use a restroom. It promotes confidentiality because the public isn't walking down hallways where confidential conversations may be occurring, and it promotes physical safety in the same way. The interview room and victim witness rooms are aimed at creating calming spaces. When people are being interviewed in those environments, they're often dealing with sensitive or traumatic information or experiences, and the goal is to minimize traumatization. So that is why calming colors, comfortable furniture. In the Sheriff's Department interview room, they have a one-way mirror that they change based on the season in order to make it more comfortable in there for people while they're reliving some sometimes horrific things that have happened to them. The renovations that have happened are great. There are still some gaps that remain. For example, many departments are housed in buildings that were not originally designed for their current purpose. For example, the medical examiner's office. It is a shared space with no meeting room. And when they're discussing sensitive information with the deceased person's family members and loved ones, it's difficult to do that in a shared environment that was not created for that purpose. And there is no viewing room for loved ones to see their family members or their bodies. Social Services was originally built as a medical facility, and you can kind of tell when you walk through the building. concrete walls and a somewhat stark environment. So there have been efforts that are made, and those can continue. The signage in our buildings is not fully inclusive of the population we serve with regard to sexual orientation, ethnicity, ability, gender identity, etc. If people don't see themselves in our staff or signage, they may not feel like our services are for them or feel safe accessing those services. And finally, our existing capital improvement plan and process doesn't really take into account the principles of trauma-informed care. Some departments indicated that they have attempted to take on minor changes themselves and have received pushback or criticism for doing so. One example is simply changing paint colors or carpeting when renovations are already slated to occur. It would be nice if we looked at the trauma-informed care principles when making decisions like that. Well, moving forward, again, we would recommend that we update signage to reflect our population, that we create and post resources that empower staff and customers with information about trauma-informed care, and that we identify renovations and consider trauma-informed care principles when those renovations occur. We understand that funding is always a factor, and identifying and applying for grants presents an opportunity to leverage staff skill sets and make meaningful changes to our physical spaces. For example, I believe that the district attorney's office utilized grant funding in order to make their renovations to the victim witness room, which has a positive impact on the victims and witnesses that are coming through the process and being prepared for the court system. So that were the recommendations and the quick wins for the physical spaces. Next, Aiden will continue with policies and procedures.
When assessing our policies and procedures, if we can go to the next slide, Lance. So we examine these benchmarks and we ask staff whether there are policies specific to trauma-informed care within their department, the extent to which personnel policies emphasize self-care, and whether policies are reviewed and updated to reflect new and emerging practices with regard to trauma-informed care. On the next slide, you can see some of the key strengths bulleted, and there's a full list of these strengths on page 17 in your report. Ultimately, we found that core values really align with and provide a foundation for us to implement trauma-informed care principles. So in interviewing one leadership member, he shared that there was like a side-by-side list of Marathon County core values with those principles of trauma-informed care, and they linked up really nicely. So just a really nice sign that we're heading in the right direction and on track. You can also see this through a number of existing policies and practices. So for example, flexible scheduling and remote work for staff. We're hearing about this more and more with technological advancements, and especially in light of COVID-19, and wanting to do our part as staff and as community members to keep everyone safe. It's also a driving factor when we look at recruiting and retaining a strong workforce. The other initiative we wanted to touch on was Handle with Care. If you're not familiar with this initiative, it was relatively new, and it basically allows for schools to be notified after a student's family has had contact with law enforcement. So the school gets a letter the next day or notification email basically saying, you know, hey, this child has had, his or her family has had contact with law enforcement. Please handle them with care. Identifying information isn't really given. They don't know the nature of what went on to protect confidentiality. But we've been seeing some really positive results with that while pre-COVID-19, while kiddos were still in school. As for the gaps, we have a full list on the report, page 18. But some of the big ones, first, it's difficult to know exactly where you're going and to make or track your progress consistently if you don't have a roadmap. And we don't currently have a roadmap. The second thing we found, for the scope of this project, we were not able to examine every departmental policy or procedure. And it was really interesting talking to staff who are working in these policies and procedures and hearing them talk about them and then go, oh, yeah, that's really trauma-informed. Or, you know, I haven't thought about that, you know, with regard to this. And in some cases, we just don't know. And in some cases, they identify there might be some room for improvement. So with regard to our recommendations, again, we have a full list of recommendations related to policies and procedures on page 19 of the report. But three of the broader opportunities we found were to adopt a trauma-informed care policy. We need a policy that provides a general framework for all of us. Second, we can also assess our policies and procedures. We have staff who are experts in what they do, and we can leverage those who work within those various policies and procedures in their departments to assess the practices they carry out through a trauma-informed lens. And we can process map the customer experience. So in light of thinking back to that trauma-informed principle related to voice and choice, it would be really valuable for us to examine the customer experience from start to finish and identify any gaps or barriers they might experience when accessing our services based on their trauma. So considering the results of our assessment and our research on trauma-informed care, Amanda can summarize the highlights for you, and then we'll share with you the steps we ultimately identified to take in order to become a more trauma-informed organization.
We were able to draw some general conclusions after breaking it down and talking and looking at Marathon County's policies. Currently, as we've said, Marathon County does not have a countywide trauma-informed care system in place. We do, however, have people and departments who care about being trauma-informed. Buy-in does vary within and across departments, and there are knowledge and training gaps that we should work on. But most importantly, our biggest takeaway was that there's a clear commitment to developing a policy, and that's reflected in our core values, our strategic plan, and the commitment many departments have demonstrated to already incorporating trauma-informed care principles into their work. More of these strengths and gaps are discussed on pages 5 and 6, but mostly I want to focus on the next steps relating to creating a trauma-informed system of care instead of just implementing the principles piece by piece. On that next slide, it's already up, I guess, we're looking at the recommended steps towards becoming a trauma-informed organization. Our recommendations are that we first adopt a trauma-informed care policy that incorporates SAMHSA's 6 principles that we discussed earlier. We assemble a trauma-informed care team of diverse stakeholders, including staff and customers, as well as a dedicated lead staff to ensure that someone is coordinating and overseeing the process of creating an intentional trauma-informed organization. Step 3 would be developing a comprehensive yet tiered strategy to implement trauma-informed care across our entire organization, while recognizing the individual needs within our varying departments. Step 4 would be providing initial and ongoing trauma-informed care training for staff at all levels, then systematically updating policies and procedures in appropriate departments. Step 6 would be assessing our physical spaces and developing plans to implement trauma-informed changes. Then this is a constant improvement, continuous improvement process. We'd ask that we reassess and evaluate our progress and then develop next steps based on that reassessment, as well as new emerging and best practices. So we would really like to thank you for your time tonight. This is a topic that we find really important, and we're glad to have the opportunity to share it with you. If anyone has questions, please let us know. There are resources in the report. There is additional information in the report that we didn't highlight in this presentation, and Ada and I are always available if you wanted to reach out afterwards if you don't have questions tonight.
I would like to thank you, Amanda and Aiden, for a great report. And I look forward to our next steps. I would open it up to the county board. Is there any questions for Amanda or Aiden? Supervisor Gumbs, you were recognized.
Chair, I cannot get my hand down. I'm sorry.
All right. Now your hand is down. Thank you. Is there any questions by the supervisors? I'll recognize the administrator, Supervisor Leonard. Well, I'm going to make you a supervisor yet.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I neglected one person to thank. The report is in your packet, and Ben Kromholtz from the library, who was integral in the original strategic plan, the design of that document, also worked with Aiden, Amanda, and Sam to put together the report you have. So special thanks also goes to Ben Kromholtz from the library.
Okay, one last call out for any questions from the board. Supervisor Krause.
Yes, I have a question. I was just wondering if this is something that's going to be worked on this year, if they're going to, or how soon they plan on working on this.
Well, the executive committee will look at the next steps and implement part of it into the work plan with the administration and where the next steps are. Any other questions? If not, I want to seriously thank Amanda and Aiden for a great report. And again, I express my sincere thank you and look forward to the next steps as we move this organization forward to utilizing trauma-informed care for the citizens of this great county. Thank you. We will move on to item number 8, review and discussion of Tuesday meeting agenda items. Under 8 is appointments by County Board Chair. Item 8A1, Board of Adjustment.
Appointing Carrie Brimmer as the second alternate to the Board of Adjustment for a 3-year term to expire June 30th, 2023.
Any questions by the board? Next, we have the County Board Size Task Force.
Appointing Supervisor John Robinson as chair, Supervisor Craig McEwen as vice chair, Supervisor Arnold Schley, Supervisor Tim Butke, Supervisor Rick Seefelt, Supervisor Jacob Longenhahn, Supervisors Sandy Seiler, Citizen Member Deb Hager, and Citizen Member David Ekman.
Any questions on those appointments? Seeing none, we will move to item 8A3, Golden Sands Resources.
Appointing Supervisor Al Drabeck for a 2-year term to expire at the County Board organizational meeting in April 2022.
Any questions on that appointment? Moving on, item 8A4, appointment to McDevco Board.
Appointing County Supervisor Becky Book to replace County Supervisor Michelle Van Cray.
Any questions on that appointment? Item 8A5, Metallic Mining Committee.
Reappointing County Supervisor Jacob Longenhahn as chair, County Supervisor John Robinson, Arnold Schley, representing a local unit of government, Al Christensen, representing a local unit of government, and Russ Wilson as a citizen member, and then appointing Jim Small and Vicky Resek as citizen members to expire at the County Board organizational meeting in April 2022.
Any questions on those appointments? Moving on to item 8A6, North Central Wisconsin Regional Planning.
Appointing Supervisor David Oberbeck to the North Central Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission, replacing Catherine Weinman.
Any questions on that appointment? Item 8A7, Northwoods Rail Commission.
Appointing Supervisor Kelly Gaber to the Northwoods Rail Transit Commission for a 2-year term to expire April 30, 2022.
And item 8A8, Regional Morgue Task Force.
The task force will be chaired by the chair of the Marathon County Public Safety Committee. Appointing Marathon County Sheriff's Department, Captain Greg Bean, Sheriff of the Regional County, Sheriff Mark Weston, Langlade County, Medical Examiner or Coroner, Scott Rifleman of Portage County, Representative of a Regional Healthcare System, Dr. Michael Clark of St. Clair's, Marathon County Emergency Management Director, Phil Rentmeester, Funeral Director, Greg Zaromsky of Peterson Kramer, Representative of the Medical College of Wisconsin, Dr. Lisa Grill Dodson. A person with expertise in business planning, Jim Warsaw.
There is going to be a correction on that. The Regional Task Force makeup charter calls for the Chair of Public Safety to chair that committee. That committee will, the Chair of Public Safety, Supervisor Boots, has asked to withdraw, and Vice Chair McEwen, for continuity, will be chairing the Regional Morgue Task Force going forward. So that appointment will be clarified on Monday, that Vice Chair McEwen will be chairing that Regional Morgue Task Force. Any questions on that appointment? And it was corrected in the packet, so we had the original that got what was updated. Moving on to item 8A9, WA Steering Committees, WCA, Wisconsin Counties Association Steering Committee, the lobbying arm of the state, of the counties, of the 72 counties.
Appointing Kurt Gibbs and John Robinson for the 2020 to 2022 term.
Any questions on those appointments? Item 8A10, WCA CAP Team.
Appointing John Robinson and Matthew Boots to the CAP team for the 2022 term.
There is also going to be a correction. Supervisor Boots is requested to withdraw, and that Supervisor Guild will be replacing Supervisor Boots as an appointment for the CAP team. Any questions on those appointments? And item 8A11, NACO, National Counties Association Representatives.
Appointing Kurt Gibbs, Matthew Boots, and Craig McEwen as NACO representatives for the 2020 to 2022 term.
Questions on that on those appointments? Okay, moving on to appointments by County Administrator. Item 8B1, Board of Health.
Appointing Dr. Corey Norbaum to a 5-year term on the Board of Health to expire December 31st, 2024.
Questions on that appointment? Seeing none, moving on to item 8B2, Community Development Block Grant Housing Regional Board.
Appointing Supervisor William Harris as Marathon County's designee to the Community Development Block Grant Housing Regional Board for a 2-year term.
Questions on that appointment? Okay, item 8B3, Highway Safety Commission.
Appointing Lieutenant Ted Connect to the Marathon County Highway Safety Commission, serving as Highway Safety Coordinator for an indefinite term.
Questions on that appointment? Item 8B4, Parks Commission appointment.
Appointing Wausau City Alderperson Jim Wadinsky and Wausau City Alderperson Don Herbst to the Park Commission to complete a 7-year term to expire June 30, 2027, or until such time as they are no longer on the City Council, whichever occurs first. And appointing Marathon County Board Supervisor Jean Mask to the Park Commission with the same time frame, until she is no longer on the board or April 2027.
Questions on those appointments? Okay, item 8B5, Public Library Board.
Appointing County Supervisor Michelle Van Cray and Meng Zhang to replace Meijer Mua for 3-year terms to expire December 31st, 2022.
Questions on that appointment, those appointments? And last but not least on the appointments, item 8B6, Solid Waste Management Board.
Appointing Matthew Hildebrandt to a 3-year term to expire April 30, 2023.
Questions on that appointment? Okay, moving on to resolutions. 1, from the Health and Human Services Committee. A, acceptance of the Trauma-Informed Care Assessment Report, Resolution 34-20. Any questions? Okay, from Human Resources, Finance and Property Committee, item 8C2A, resolution approving the grant by Marathon County for a permanent easement and perpetual right of entry at 400 East Thomas Street and a temporary easement and perpetual right of entry to 400 East Thomas Street to the City of Wausau, Resolution 35-20. Questions on that? Again, from the Human Resources, Finance and Property Committee, item 8C2B, to extend 1 part-time custodian from .50, 20 hours per week, to .725, 29 hours per week, full-time equivalent for the Sheriff's Office, effective 4/5/20. Resolution 36-20. Questions? And then item 8C2C, approve 2020 budget transfers for Marathon County Department of Appropriations, Resolution 37-20. Questions on those budget transfers? Item 8C3 from the Infrastructure Committee, item 8C3A, resolution petitioning the Secretary of Transportation for airport improvement aid by Central Wisconsin Joint Airport Board, Marathon and Portage County, Wisconsin, Resolution 38-20. Okay, moving on to announcements and/or requests. I have several announcements. First, you should have received in your email an email from the UW Extension in cooperation with Wisconsin Counties Association about some training dates that are coming up. It's called the COWS training, or Counties Elected Officials training. And those training dates are June 8th, June 15th, June 22nd, and June 29th, all of which take place via the WebEx. And those trainings start from 9 o'clock and run to 10:30 each of those dates. Each of those dates are different topics. So I would encourage not only the newly elected county officials, but also veterans to review those topics. There is no cost, but you do have to register. So I would encourage you to review that. If you did not receive that email, I also forwarded it out earlier this evening to all the supervisors. It should be in your email box as far as that training. Also, to let everyone know, they should have received a packet notifying you of the Wisconsin Counties Association Annual Conference, which is scheduled for September 20th, 21st, and 22nd at the Kalahari Resort and Convention Center in Wisconsin Dells. As of this point, that conference has not been canceled. Registration opens on June 1. One of the things that the Wisconsin Counties Association has done historically has allowed without a requirement for registration fees. So the Wisconsin Counties Association waives the registration fee for first-year county supervisors. There is a requirement, though, that registration is needed for hotels and reservations are needed for hotels. That reservations fill up very quickly. If you are interested, historically, the county has authorized the first-term supervisors to attend the Wisconsin Counties Association Annual Convention, and also the chair, the vice chair, and the chair of each of the standing committees. So if you have an interest in attending that, the clerk would need to know, and we would need to know before June 1st so that she could get a head count as far as the number of rooms to try to reserve. Also, the Marathon County Board of Supervisors does have what we affectionately call the Sunshine Fund. That fund is money that is contributed by each of the supervisors to be utilized for sending out cards and flowers for funerals of immediate family of supervisors, and or send out well wishes for individuals who have been hospitalized or have serious illnesses. So I would encourage that fund has been depleted, so I would encourage the next time that you are in the courthouse, if you so desire, to stop in at the clerk's office and donate whatever you wish to, so that we can bring some additional funds into that amount. And then one last announcement. This weekend is a Memorial Day, and we want to recognize and remember the individuals who have made and fought for this country and given the ultimate sacrifice. That's what Memorial Day is. And so then I would ask everybody to keep those in their memory and or prayers. We have Supervisor Fisher with an announcement.
Yes, thank you, Chair Gibbs. I just wanted to take 1 second here at the end of the meeting. Prior to this meeting and after the last meeting on April 26th, we had a single home structure fire here in the Village of Maine. This was responded to by the fire departments from the Village of Maine, the Town of Texas, the Town of Hamburg, City of Wausau, Safer, the City of Wausau Police, as well as the Wisconsin State Patrol. I'd just like to make note that we had two individuals, Dennis Paulson and Paula Paulson, from the Town of Hamburg Volunteer Fire Department. Actually, they were the first on the scene, and without their gear, noticing the fire, actually ran in, risking their lives to save the homeowner prior to the complete loss of the structure. I would like to just note that this drive, showed through with these two volunteer heroes, and just wanted to say thank you to both Paula and Dennis, as well as to all of our local first responders, whether paid or volunteer, and all the services that help to keep us all safe. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other announcements and or requests by board members? Seeing none, I will declare this meeting adjourned. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. The next meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, May 26th at 7 o'clock. Thank you and have a happy Memorial Day weekend.